Are the religious just wasting their time repeatedly sharing the gospel with people who clearly know better and have no interest in it at all? Why, yes they are. But that doesn't stop them, does it? As we will explore next. Hey, it's our buddy Alan Shlemon with another Stands Against Reason video. This time trying to tell the Christian closet apologists why they fail so miserably at sharing the gospel. And of course, it's never the message, it's the messenger. Or maybe it's God, who knows? But keep on trying because eventually, someday, maybe, you'll get through to them. Or maybe you won't. It's all confusing. So let's see why Alan thinks that sharing the gospel with non-believers is a worthwhile endeavor, and why I think it's just a waste of time.
How do you revisit the gospel with someone who says, "Enough of that"?
Maybe respect their wishes and leave them alone? Nah, you have to keep cramming your silly book of mythology down their throat, right?
The answer to this question hinges on what happened during your interaction to cause the person to respond to the gospel in that way.
How about, I think this book is stupid, irrational, completely intellectually indefensible, and you won't shut the hell up about this stupid book or your idiotic beliefs. Because I think that's a perfectly valid reason to want to be left alone by the religious zealots. I'm sure Alan disagrees, though.
And that's why we at Stand to Reason try to focus on helping Christians become better at being a certain kind of person.
Ignorant. You work hard to keep your followers ignorant. It's in every video you make. It's why you tell your followers to hide, to ask questions and not answer any, to do everything they can not to have to actually justify their faith, because you know that their faith is unjustifiable. We know what you're up to. It's absurdly obvious.
We call that person an ambassador.
I call that person an idiot. But you have to remember that you're not here to find the truth, you're here to push a narrative. And while you're typically quivering in your religious safe space away from the damning eyes of the rational, once in a while you have to send out a human sacrifice to make it appear that your faith is anything worth standing up for. I guess we could also call those people cannon fodder.
And the reason we call them an ambassador is because the Bible tells us in 2 Corinthians 5:20 that we're all ambassadors for Christ.
How's that going for you? Because apparently the Stands Against Reason crowd aren't ambassadors of anything but their own bank accounts. I don't see you guys out on the front lines practicing what you preach. You're too busy making videos with closed comments.
And we believe, therefore, that you need 3 essential skills to be an effective ambassador: knowledge, wisdom, and character.
3 things that religious apologists entirely lack. Let's see them try to play some word games, though.
Knowledge is the content of what you say. That is the substance of the gospel. You have to get the correct facts about what God's message is to those who have not accepted his pardon.
And that's the problem. You're not interested in the facts. You're interested only in your emotionally comforting beliefs. Facts are demonstrable, testable, and objectively verifiable. All you're doing is reading from an ancient book of mythology, believing it all gullibly, and expecting everyone else you talk to do the same. That's not what knowledge is.
And this requires simple reading, it requires learning and memorization of the message of reconciliation that comes through Jesus.
It requires blind acceptance of something that cannot be independently verified or rationally proven. It's all wishful thinking.
Now, the second skill, wisdom, has to do with how you package the contents of the gospel message.
Because you can't do it intellectually, only emotionally. You can't say, here's what it says in my big book of multiple choice, and this is how I can independently prove that any of it is true. That's not how it works. Instead, you have to make emotional appeals and fallacious arguments that make the whole thing sound a lot more reasonable than it actually is. I don't know that I could call blatant dishonesty wisdom, but you do you, I guess.
You can't just dump your knowledge on people. You have to know how to communicate what you know.
And that's the problem. You don't actually know anything. You believe things. You have blind faith in things. You want to impart that blind faith to others and push them to accepting the same ridiculous nonsense that you do uncritically. That's not how knowledge works.
And so this skill ensures that the gospel is clearly and persuasively articulated to another person.
Persuasively, just like the non-existent benefits of snake oil are persuasively articulated to the rubes. Because that's what religious apologetics is. It's selling a bill of goods to an audience that the apologist hopes is more ignorant than they are. And if they're not, the apologist is just boned and has to retreat to their safe space. Look at all of the advice these guys give, because that is exactly what they describe.
Now the third skill, character, has to do with the manner in which you tell a person the gospel. Because even if your knowledge and your wisdom is impeccable, but you come across like a jerk, it won't matter then.
Because who would think that any of these self-righteous jackasses are jerks, right? You know, people who are convinced that the all-powerful creator of the universe is their best friend and they get to speak on his behalf. Who would ever object to that?
Because your poor conversational character will completely undermine the gospel message.
The gospel doesn't need your help. It falls apart just fine on its own. All it takes is someone willing to examine it in detail without the cumbersome burden of irrational faith, and the whole thing becomes a laughable joke. Maybe you ought to worry more about having a worthwhile message before you start being concerned with how you present it.
Now, I'm not assuming that you dropped the ball in one of those three skills. I'm simply trying to help you evaluate what you might do before you revisit the gospel with someone.
And the one thing that you haven't even considered is, what if the person you're trying to revisit the gospel with simply knows more than you, has no interest in your silly mythology, and just wants to be left alone? Now, that never happens, right?
So ask yourself this question: how did I do in those three ambassador skills when I shared the gospel?
It doesn't matter. What matters is whether or not your message is worth relaying to begin with, and honestly, while I know you'll never admit it, it isn't. It just isn't. Having to look for successively stupider and more ignorant people to pass along your stupid and ignorant message to isn't a tactic that you ought to be proud of. You ought to care if what you're preaching is worthwhile in the first place. But that's not a consideration, is it?
Now, either you did well or you did not. If you feel you did well, then maybe there's nothing you did to drive them away. It could just be that they reject the gospel itself.
And why would they do that? Maybe because the Gospels are laughably ridiculous. Maybe because the claims made in the Bible are absurdly untenable and irrational on their face. That couldn't be it, could it?
After all, Scripture describes the gospel as offensive and a stumbling block.
To anyone who actually cares about reality or demands that the things they allow into their heads be demonstrably true. And it should be.
And so therefore, pray and wait for another opportunity later.
Or just give up. Okay, yeah, I know that's not an option, but why does this really sound like the kind of tactics used by pedophiles? The little kid wouldn't take your candy, then just watch and wait for another opportunity because sooner or later you'll be able to get them alone. The idea that maybe, just maybe, you shouldn't be doing this at all? Yeah, that's not even a consideration.
Also remember that it's God's job to convict people of sin and save them, not yours.
Which is a convenient excuse when you fail miserably time and time again. Maybe God didn't want to convert them. Well, if that's the case, then why do you keep trying? Why are you telling God that he's wrong? Think, McFly, think!
It's your job to be a faithful ambassador, to share the truth in a persuasive yet gracious manner. Then leave the results up to God.
Funny, God hasn't convinced me of anything. Maybe that's because there's no reason to think that God exists in the first place. Yeah, that couldn't be it.
If, however, you feel like you dropped the ball in one or more of those three areas, then you need to evaluate which ambassador skills you need to improve. And not only will that help you when you revisit the gospel with your friend, it'll also positively affect every relationship you have.
Assuming you have any friends left after you've been an incessant bother with your silly religious beliefs. Oh, we know the religious like to say they have atheist friends or non-Christian friends, but we all know that's not true. They have people who put up with them right up until the religious drivel comes out, and then they roll their eyes and think, here we go again. It doesn't impress anyone. It just doesn't. People probably put up with you in spite of your religious convictions, not because of them. Besides, if it's God's job to convince people, what does he need you for? Why do you have to be involved at all? Can't God just magically make people believe? How did you become an integral part of God's grand plan? Yeah, I know, they have no explanations for that, but you'd think that they would. Instead, they just have excuses, and they're really good at excuses. That's what the entire Stand to Reason ministry is based on, making excuses for why things don't work out the way they think they should. Why doesn't anyone believe you? Why doesn't God work in a rational and understandable way? Why doesn't God do what the Bible promises he will? The honest answer is, there's no reason to think that God is real, but they can't admit to that, so they just invent rationalizations for why none of the things they believe actually work out the way that they want. Why doesn't everyone just automatically, instantly believe their silly religious hokum? There has to be an explanation, right? It can't be that it's ridiculous and wholly irrational, and only a gullible moron would buy into such unsupportable garbage. That's not possible, so they make excuses, and those excuses are uniformly absurd. And when we point out just how absurd they are, they cry religious discrimination, call us a bunch of meanies, and make up even more excuses for why we're so terrible to their pathetic beliefs. And they wonder why we call them stands against reason. I don't. Not for a second.